So hi, my name is Timothy Devin. I'm a system engineer for Veeam software, and with me is Sander Berkauer. He's an MVP for Microsoft Active Directories and one of the biggest experts in the fields. And today we'll talk about Active Directory, the basics. Now, this webinar is part of a three-part series, and so today we talk about the basics, but in the following webinars we'll talk about virtualization or Active Directory and virtualization. And in the final webinar we'll talk about how Active Directory works in conjunction with Veeam backup and replication. How should you do the backups, but more importantly, how should you do the restores? So Sander, good luck to you.
Thank you, Timothy. Yep. So we are go. Cool. I just took up the challenge and explain to you the Active Directory basics in under 60 minutes. So we've got, we've still got 57 minutes ahead of us, where I'll try and show you what Active Directory is, how you can use it, and I'll share my best practices that I've been using for the last couple of years, so you can just benefit from that. Now, this webinar is targeted at the pure basics. That doesn't mean that you're a beginner necessarily. That doesn't mean that you know nothing of about IT. It means nothing. It's just that I'm going to take you on a journey today, and we're going to discover Active Directory, and we're just going to have loads of fun because we're going to look under the hood of Active Directory. We're going to look at objects and attributes and replication and multi-master and flexible single master operations, all of the stuff that doesn't mean anything to you right now, but it does after this session. Then we're going to discuss the role of Active Directory. And when I say discuss, I mean discuss. If you've got questions, if you've got remarks, just get them out there. Timothy and I are looking at them. Well, actually, Timothy is looking at them. I'll ask him, do you see anything? Is there any questions, anything? Of course, we'll take care of them. And then we'll finish it off with some best practices and a conclusion. So don't hesitate to get your questions in because we will look at them. No worries. When I look at Active Directory, what I see is a means for organization to achieve device-independent productivity. So if I take a Windows device and I just log on to that without Active Directory, then I have a username and password and a profile and stored passwords, stuff like that. If I get another machine, and trust me, way more people than 5 years ago have more than one device at home. If I get another device, I got another set of credentials. Sure, you can make it so that it has the same username and the same password, but it's a different set of credentials. It's a different profile. Nothing is synced by default. Active Directory is a technology that helps organizations do that. So now your credentials are not stored on just simple devices. They're stored in the data center. They're stored on servers. They're centralized. And now you can just, with that one set of credentials, you can achieve on-premises single sign-on on all those devices. And on-premises, you know what is on-premises? It just means between the walls of your organizations. So if you step through the door, you're on-premises. You can also be on cloud, in the cloud. You can have cloud applications and stuff like that. You can tie those to Azure Active Directory, and you can tie your Azure Active Directory to Active Directory. And that way you could extend your on-premises single sign-on to cloud single sign-on, all using that one set of credentials in that centralized identity store that we call Active Directory. Then, of course, there's loads and loads of third-party software and even Microsoft software for centralized systems management, like System Center Configuration Manager or ZenWorks. Then, of course, you could synchronize the profiles on devices and settings, even from Windows devices through third-party solutions to MacBooks, for a consistent user experience. And the distributed file system is right there for your convenience. I'm going to touch all of this in this session. But first, let's look under the hood. So let's look at all that nitty-gritty stuff that makes it work. And of course, the first thing that you'll notice is that Active Directory has domain controllers. And domain controllers are, you could say, they're special Windows servers. They are Windows servers. Active Directory still runs on Windows Server only. While you can have SQL Server on Linux these days, domain controllers are going to run on Windows Server. And you can have physical Windows Server devices in your data centers installed in racks. You can touch them. They've got buttons and stuff like that. Or virtual machines running as domain controllers, running on virtualization hosts. And you can touch the virtualization host, but you can no longer really touch the virtual machine without using the virtualization software or the management console of your virtualization solution. So those are two flavors that you can have domain controllers in. And to make a normal Windows server, a special Windows server, a domain controller, you will need the Active Directory Domain Services role. And you can install that. Since Windows Server 2008 R2, we've got a server manager that allows you to add and remove, if you want, roles and features to Windows Server. Actually, it's been back way before, but that's all legacy stuff. I'm not going to talk about that. And when you install the Active Directory Domain Services role automatically on Windows servers, you will have the Active Directory Domain Services management tools, unless you're installing the Active Directory Domain Services role on a server core installation. Now, a server core installation doesn't have much of the desktop graphical user interface that what is normal? But a normal Windows server has, a Windows server that looks like a Windows desktop. So it doesn't really make sense to have the Active Directory Domain Services management tools on that box. And that's why, if you look at the Remote Server Administration Tools, or RSAT, there's a possibility, an opportunity to install the Active Directory Domain Services management tools on domain-joined devices, domain-joined Windows-based devices, so you can manage your domain controllers remotely. So now you can just sit behind your desktop, do all the management stuff that they want you to do, without you having to walk to the data center room, without having to unlock it, without having to open the door to your server rack, without opening the console, stuff like that, just from your desktop. So that's great stuff. And in fact, I think one of the recommendations that I can already give you this early in the session is that if you want to have domain controllers, make sure they don't have a desktop. You don't need a graphical user interface for that. I've got one for my demo, but that's okay. So we talked about physical hosts, virtual machines. We talked about with a GUI, without the GUI. But there's two more flavors to domain controllers. Because you've got read-write domain controllers, and those are your standard run-of-the-mill domain controllers. They can do anything you want. And there's this special breed of domain controllers. It's read-only domain controllers. It's domain controllers that only have read-only access to the database and read-only access to the DNS domain zone information on it. And if you can just query it, you can do stuff with it, you can authenticate against it, but when you want to change things, then you'll be referred to a read-write domain controller. And read-only domain controllers are especially suited for situations like branch offices and perimeter networks. So these are kind of the flavors you have for domain controllers.
Okay, we already have some questions, by the way. So first of all, some people are asking, so this is a three-part series. Where can I find the second webinar, the third webinar? Well, if you go to the Veeam website, you have there a tab, let's say resources, and under resources you will find expert webinars. If you click there, you will find this webinar, and if you click that one, you will go to a central landing page for this webinar series, where you will find links to all the other parts as well. So you can find it there. Now, another additional question popped up and was a typical question: should we virtualize everything, or should we at least keep one physical? But I think we're covering that one in the second series, right, Sander?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. And then we have one final question somebody is asking. So Microsoft has this huge hype about nano servers. So how does that work with Active Directory? Can we install Active Directory on nano server?
So Nano Server is a feature for Windows Server. You could say it's a different flavor of Windows Server, but it's an installation option for Windows Server 2016 that is out on the market now for a couple of months. It does not have Active Directory domain services. So a Nano Server, although it is primed for all infrastructure tasks and services, you can't use it as a domain controller, unfortunately.
Okay, so that's it for the questions.
Right, well, let's go on then. So the next slide, and this slide is about grouping of domain controllers. So I think you're lucky as an IT guy to be a domain admin or an Active Directory administrator. You know, it's a nice job, and it's nice if you have 2 or 3 or 4 domain controllers. You know, it's manageable. You can treat them like pets. You don't have to treat them like cattle yet. But when you do, when your organization grows, and many organizations that have deployed Active Directory actually do grow, then you'll end up with more and more and more domain controllers. And it kind of becomes unmanageable if you just go through and through and through installing domain controllers like you normally do. So there's 3 types of grouping that you can apply to domain controllers. They mostly apply to bigger environments, but you can also apply them to smaller environments. So the first type of grouping is an Active Directory site. If you have 2 offices, for instance, and those guys have, you know, you've got a switch, a network switch at every office, you've got servers, you've got nice high-speed connectivity there, but you've got a really slow, tight VPN connection between them. Then you don't want any Active Directory traffic over that connection all the time. So you don't want the Windows devices that are domain joined on one site in one office to purposely authenticate to the domain controller on the other side. That will certainly result in slow authentication. You will get some incidents in your change management and your incident management software solution. So you don't want that. But Active Directory has a solution for that. So in Active Directory, you can create Active Directory sites. And you can create an Active Directory site, and you can assign a subnet to an Active Directory site. So every time a Windows device comes to Active Directory and say, you know what, I've got a dude here, he wants to authenticate. Can we do that dance? Then Active Directory will actually look at the IP address of the device and say, you belong to that site, so please authenticate to the domain controller that is nearest to you, probably the domain controller in the office that you're at. That's the way Active Directory sites helps you keep Active Directory fast. Now, of course, there's also other types of groupings, like the Active Directory domain. And the Active Directory domain is a container for replication. So all the domain controllers that you have that are part of an Active Directory domain replicate all the information with each other. So it's like the password changes, it's the last logon times. All that stuff is replicated between all the domain controllers. Everyone is keeping everyone up to date. So if you have another domain controller sitting somewhere else, then it might not be a good idea to have that domain controller replicate all the stuff. Now, if you want to avoid having network traffic to a remote domain controller, you might opt to not do an Active Directory site, but to create another Active Directory domain. Alas, the downside of that choice is that Active Directory domains are identified by DNS domain name. So like Microsoft.com and other domain names that you know from the internet, Active Directory has a DNS domain name as well. You can have a .local domain, we see that a lot still, or you can have a subdomain for your organizational name on the internet. I've got a demo environment that I'll show you after this slide that has the veeamvanguards.com domain name. And I use that purposely because if I have another domain somewhere else, I can name it something else. And it will show that it is another replication container. And if I go from that domain to my domain where I, for instance, have a file server, then the guy or girl trying to do that will authenticate to the domain controller in his or her domain and then authenticate to my domain controllers before getting access to the file server. So there is no replication if you have an Active Directory trust between Active Directory domains. Then, of course, if we're talking about brotherly trusts between domains, you can also have the child-parent kind of trust between Active Directory domains. So if you have an Active Directory domain like veeamvanguards.com, you can actually create a child domain like child.veeamvanguards.com and have a relationship between those domains as part of the Active Directory forest. Now, in an Active Directory forest, the child and parent, just like in real life, are inseparable. The child cannot live without the parent. So if you want to have something in a child domain go to another domain outside of the forest, you will have to do it over again. The fun part about an Active Directory forest and the child-parent relationship is that each domain in the forest shares the Active Directory schema. And the schema is the stuff that defines everything in Active Directory. So not the settings themselves, but the definition of the stuff in it. I got a slide later on where I'll show you.
Okay, we have some questions popping up. So
right.
somebody's asking, so what about a domain controller in the DMZ? So is it a good idea, or at what point is it a good idea to put a domain controller in the DMZ?
All right, so we see this situation a lot. If you're a bigger company, you've got a lot of web servers. You've got a lot of web servers in the DMZ, they become unmanageable as well. You've got the same problem that you would have with 10 or 15 loosely coupled Windows devices without Active Directory. So you would want Active Directory in the DMZ so you could just centrally manage those web servers. So you could just start and stop a group policy stuff in IIS from a central location. Now for that situation, the solution is either a read-only domain controller, although it doesn't add that much, or a separate Active Directory forest or an Active Directory domain outside of the forest that is used for authentication. But remember that a DMZ or a perimeter network is by default a more unsecure network than your internal network or the network where your Active Directory domain controllers are. So it might not be the best idea to extend your trusted network of domain controllers to an untrusted network like a DMZ. But of course, everyone is free to choose whatever they want strategically.
Okay, so we get another question here. What will be the best practice to configure Active Directory in two different sites, such as corp and branch? I'm guessing what we are asking here is when should we choose to create two different sites, or when should we have one site, even if it's two different branch offices?
Oh, that's a cool question. You know what? I'm going to show that with my demo environment. So I'm going to quickly switch to that. And I'm going to close all that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to first show you the Active Directory management tools that you have. So there's the Active Directory Administrator Center. It's the new tool that Microsoft wants you to use because it's really cool. It's got some nice features. And you've got the Active Directory Users and Computers, which is the old tool, which still works, but doesn't show everything or doesn't allow everything. Then there's Active Directory Domains and Trusts. So if you've got a domain, you can trust other domains and stuff like that. Then, of course, there's the Active Directory module for Windows PowerShell, because, if you want to change something on a couple of domain controllers, just don't do that from the GUI because it will just cost you more time. And then there's the Active Directory Sites and Services. Right here, let's click that. It'll take a moment to start. And what you'll see in this environment is that I already got 2 Active Directory sites right here on the left. So there's the first site. I renamed that because it used to be the default first site name. So I renamed that to first site. You can do that without problems. And it has got my domain controller in it. And I created a second site. And what I did is I created subnets, just like this, for 10.000/24 for first site and 10.1.0.0/24 for second site. So what you see here is that I've got 2 offices, each with their own IP addressing scheme, and I've got those connected through a VPN. Now if you've got a desktop computer trying to authenticate, it will be directed to domain controllers in the site that is nearest. Now, of course, I can just create a new site. I just right-click it, create a new site, like the third site. Can't have spaces. And I will use the default IP site link. So it's there. You've got a nice to-do list, actually. So ensure this, add that, install that. So it's okay. So now I've got a third site, and I can have a subnet. I click create a new subnet. It's a 10.2.0.0/24 subnet, and I assign it to the third site. Then when I create a domain controller in the same subnet, or I install it, and then I switch the IP configuration so it matches some of the other sites and then move it there, authentications will still be fast. It's the only reason why you'd want Active Directory sites. It is to keep Active Directory fast, authentication fast. There's a couple of more advanced scenarios where you'd want Active Directory sites, but this is the main reason why. If you have a VPN connection and it's less than 2 megabits, use an Active Directory site.
Okay, Sander. So we have a couple of questions here, and actually 2 are quite related. So somebody's actually asking, what about remote management? And somebody else is asking, and I'm pretty sure you want to cover that one as well, is can you show me the new Active Directory management tool? And I'm guessing he's referring to the administrative center. So could you briefly show it, or are you going to show it later?
No, I can show it now. It is actually fun, and I'm kind of a fan of the new tool because this is the old tool, and it's a Microsoft Management Console snap-in. You can add task pads and stuff like that. You can delegate it, but it still isn't as cool as the Active Directory Administrative Center. I apologize. It takes a little bit longer to start, but then you've got the full feature set of Active Directory right here. So you can still delegate stuff. There's still the reset password stuff that you see here. If you're an account operator, this will work right off the bat. You can just use that. You won't have to click anywhere. Just use that, reset someone's password. It's not a problem. So what I've got here is, and this is familiar, is the old tree view that you've got here. I created an organizational unit. It's named Vanguards. I've got the countries here that harbor Vanguards today. So it's quite an international bunch of people, and I can do all kinds of stuff like that. The fun part is, though, if I take one of the Dutch theme Vanguards and I created a group and stuff like that, if I have something that I want to change for a whole lot of Veeam Vanguards, then I can just kind of record my steps. So to me, this is the most important feature of the Active Directory Administrative Center. And it's right here at the bottom. It's just a little button. It's called the Windows PowerShell History view. So I open that up. It's really empty, but let's look at Joop and let's look at its properties. And you know what? Let's use one of the more typical stuff that we would want to do. Joop has been a Veeam Vanguard for the last 2 years. He's been a founding Vanguard. He's not going to go away very soon. So let's give him the option to protect him from accidental deletion. Just a small option to set with big consequences. And it's fun because now if I click OK, here in the PowerShell history viewer, I can actually see the command that did that. This is actually the command that set that up for Joop. And now, of course, the identity, you could actually get that to, I don't know, get-80user -o, for instance. And you could set the protected from accidental deletion flag, which actually sets for delegation permissions, but that's okay, to a lot of objects all in the same time. And you don't even have to think about how you would do that with PowerShell. It's right here. It's on a silver plate just there to do.
Hey Sander, that's quite cool. I think that really helpful, for example, when you want to do remote management or you want to do mass deployment, like create a lot of users all at once, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So somebody is asking, can we install it under Windows 7? I believe you can with the AirSat tools, but I'm not 100% sure.
So Windows 7 has the RSAT tools of Windows Server 2008 R2, and that's the first version that Active Directory Administrative Center is part of the remote server administration toolset. Yes.
Okay.
But it's a version 1.
Okay. So for the recent one, you probably need Windows 8 or Windows 10 or something like that.
Of course, For some reasons, you will want the latest version, like Windows 10. It's got a lot of security features in it that are backed by Active Directory. For some reasons, you might want Windows 7 because it is a more familiar interface without towels. Yeah, it's whatever you want. Absolutely. Okay. And darn it, I thought someone was going to ask me to delete Joop. But okay, I'll just ask myself then, could you delete Joop? Because you know what, we've set the requirement for protected from accidental deletion. So now if I delete him, it will ask me, are you sure? Because it's still a Microsoft product. And I'll try it, and it'll say, you know what? You do not have sufficient credentials, or this object is protected from accidental deletion. So it will actually tell you that. It's such a cool tool. Cool, but let's continue. We didn't have any other questions, right?
Oh, we do have a bunch of questions actually, so I'm trying to not to interrupt you too much, but still, somebody's asking about Active Directory Federation services, if we could touch briefly on that, but I think that's, if we have to start talking about that, that's going to be out of scope, right?
It is way out of scope, yeah. And I can talk about Active Directory Federation services for days, but unfortunately we don't have the time for that, yeah.
Yeah. Somebody else is asking, so if we have a multi-domain, can another computer from another domain, or can a user log in from one in a computer in another domain? I guess if there is a trust, it's possible, right?
Yeah, if there's a two-way trust, you can do that. Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I'm just trying to scroll over the questions quickly. What is the best path to move domain controller to a new data center? I guess that's by creating a new one and then promoting it.
Yep. Yeah, it's just creating a new Windows server and promoting it. Absolutely.
And then demoting the other one. That's going to be the easiest one, I guess. Best practices to name DCS. I think you already touched that lightly. Nowadays, more looking at a public, fully qualified domain name with a real TLD if you own that. So you're Azure ready, right?
Yes, yes. And absolutely. And the fun part is if you're going to look at the Active Directory sites or the domain controller names themselves, one of the easiest tricks that I've learned from working with an international company is to name your sites to the nearest airport code, and to begin or include the nearest airport code in the names of your domain controllers. So if there's something wrong with it, you know where you have to fly to.
That's actually a fun one. Another question that pops up, what is the best practice if somebody leaves a company? Should we delete them? I guess the best practice there is to just disable them temporarily.
It is something that many organizations are struggling with these days, yes. And it depends on all the stuff that you have that is integrated with Active Directory. So if all the other applications, services, systems, if the access to all that breaks when you disable a user account, then yes, disabling is a good way. If it doesn't, and you really want to lock out someone, then yes, you'll have to delete the user account. Okay. So it is sort of common sense. Yes.
Yeah. So we got another question here. What about the oldest functional level that the administrative center can manage? I guess that should be 2012, or can it also manage the 2003s and 2008 just without all the extra features?
Yeah, so Windows Server 2003 forced functional level and domain functional level is the oldest forced functional level that is manageable today with the tools. In Windows Server 2016, we're seeing a move towards the Windows Server 2008 forest and domain functional levels.
Okay.
It's funny though, because I don't even have a slide on the functional levels. Wow. All right.
So maybe a follow-up question. So somebody's asking, should we upgrade the functional level?
Yeah. So that's a good question as well. And I've covered the forest and domain functional levels during TechEd when I was there with Mike from Veeam as well. And there is functionality that will make your life easier if you upgrade to certain forest and domain functional levels. What we always remember about the functional levels is that it will keep us from installing down-level domain controller Windows Server versions. But there's more and more stuff that is unlocked through the forest functional level. And it is becoming a feature requirement these days for migrations. So yeah, it's something to look at carefully. Okay. Of course, since Windows Server 2008 or 2, you can revert back to older functional levels if need be.
Okay, great. Somebody else asked us about, can you talk more about the PowerShell functionality? Well, personally, I can already tell you, I was playing, so we did this webinar for the EMEA, and Sander showed me the administrative console, and I totally forgot about that. And actually, I needed to create a massive amount of users, just do it in the administrative console, copy the PowerShell code that is generated there, and then you can easily just create a for loop around it and create multiple users really easily. So I definitely recommend you to look at the administrative center if you want to get started with the PowerShell functionality.
I agree. It's the easiest way to learn Active Directory PowerShell.
And then we get some more questions about what about Active Directory and virtualization. I do want to point out that we will cover this in the second part. So we already have a massive amount of questions, so we'll not be answering those. And about the recovery part, we'll also be covering this in the second or in the third webinar. For disaster recovery, I think just to be very short there, I think the easiest way to do good disaster recovery is just to make sure that you have Active Directory at all sites and letting Active Directory handling all the replication. But I don't know, maybe it's depending on the scenario, but that's my personal favorite. I don't know about you, Sander?
Oh yeah, I would even go further than that. And the entire sentence that you just used, I would just pick 2 words: sure backup.
Yeah.
All right.
So finally, somebody asking how would you one go about maintaining the synchronization time synchronization between two domains? I guess the most important there is that you enable time services in Windows and you get the NTP services running, right?
Oh yes, but I've got a recommendation on that later on the slide, so um, we'll talk about that. No worries.
Okay.
Let's dive.
Let's
Let's just
go. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go. Let's go to the Active Directory database. So every domain controller that you promote is going to have the Active Directory database. It is called the ntds.dit. It can grow pretty large, and if you have if you have more than 300,000 users, then you'll see that you'll want to use more than 4 gigs of RAM in a domain controller, for instance. And there's also a couple of helper files that you have in the folder where you have your ntds.dit. So there's 2 transaction logs. It's Active Directory uses the same database scheme as Exchange Server does. So you're probably, if you know Exchange Server, you know how transaction logs work. These are rotated automatically. You can't disable the circular logging in Active Directory, which is, I think, is a good thing. And there's some check files and stuff like that, just to make sure that your domain controller database is running the best it can. The database consists of 2 main parts. So there's the definition of objects, the schema, and there's the configuration of objects. Now the schema is just a layout of the database, if you will. It's the column names, if you will, if you use the analogy of an Excel file. So it'll tell you if a user account has a first name, if it can have a first name, or if it must have a first name when you create it. That's the stuff that is defined in the schema. Microsoft delivers a pretty robust schema out of the box, and you can extend it with your own schema extensions if you want. There's nothing there in the schema that will actually do work for you. That's the configuration. Every user object that you create lives in the configuration. So every user, every group membership lives in the configuration part of the Active Directory database. The schema just tells them how they're related. And if you look inside the database, and I've got a sample Active Directory users and computers screenshot right here. Inside the database, there's objects. So there's user objects and there's computer objects. And each of the objects in Active Directory is identified with a security identifier, a SID. And every relationship is based on that SID. So if I have a user that is member of a group, then the user has a SID and the group has a SID. And underneath in a database, those 2 SIDs are tied together with a backlink. The other stuff that I have in Active Directory is containers. So there's the basic containers. The UI shows them as folders, and the containers are the basic folders. So in the UI, you can't really delete them. And I'm not going to show you how to do that with PowerShell, but you can figure it out yourself. And then there's the organizational units. And the organizational units can be deleted, but you might not want to do that. Another fun part of the organizational unit is that you can apply a group policy to an organizational unit. So if an organizational unit, the folder, has user objects or computer objects, then I can create a group policy that will set certain settings for all the users or all the computers in that organizational unit at once. And it will replicate and it will be picked up, and every user or computer in scope will just do what you tell it to do. Objects live with attributes. So, well, you would say a computer has properties. Everything in Active Directory, which is a property, is called an attribute. So the member of property or attribute, for instance, for a group tells you that it has group memberships. It will tell you who's a member of that group. And attributes can be either single valued, which is great for a first name or a surname, or it can be multi-valued, which is great for group memberships. Both exist at the same time within Active Directory. So let's see.
Okay, we still have a couple of questions here. Somebody's asking, you cannot disable, you mentioned that you cannot disable circular logging. I've seen somewhere that you can disable it in 2008 R2, but I guess I'm not sure, but how much can you tune that database and why would you need that, right?
Yeah, so the only thing that really tunes the database is the fact that you store it on a RAID configuration of disks, for instance. If you'd make sure that throughout the stack, and it's especially important for virtual domain controllers, that you've got the disk optimizations. And the other thing is that you could allow a domain controller to cache its entire entity.s.did in RAM. That's the only three real ways to tune up your Active Directory. Circular logging and stuff like that, even if you do enable or disable the circular logging stuff in Active Directory, you can't go back to a moment in time based on those transaction logs. It will just be ignored. There's no way in the Microsoft solutions that you could use those files. So I don't see a way to use, or I don't see a reliable method of taking advantage of that.
Okay, so we got a couple of questions because everybody saw the SIT. Should we run sysprep basically before we, because we're using imaging tools, should we run sysprep before we join the domain controller to the domain actually, or create a new domain controller in the domain?
So that's a good question, and it's actually one of the best practices that I'm showing you later. So yes, absolutely.
And then we got one guy asking, so I guess he actually has some issues with Active Directory because he says, I can only see the SITs, but they are no longer identified. So I'm guessing he only sees the identifiers, but no longer the real name. Is it safe to remove them, or do you think it's better to troubleshoot it with, for example, Microsoft support?
Yeah, so the main reason for that is probably something in replication, and I'll show you how that might have happened. It is interesting to have someone with that particular problem within the audience today. Wow, that's cool. That person is gonna enjoy the coming 5 minutes of this presentation.
Okay, so let's hang on, and then somebody's asking, so how long does it take to do a sync? But I guess that depends on if it's in the same site or if it's inter-site, right?
Absolutely. Yep, I'm going to cover that too. Because I got a slide, this is a slide completely designated to replication and high availability. Okay. So there's two types of replication. There's intra-site replication, so that is replication within an Active Directory site, and there's inter-site replication, which is the replication between sites, between domain controllers, or actually the bridgehead servers that are designated as bridgehead servers between two sites. So inter-site replication works with change notifications. So a domain controller will actually tell all the other domain controllers that it is replicating with that he or she, I don't know, are we calling a domain controller he or she? I'm not sure. Anyway, he or she has updates and come get them. And then there's a pull replication that gets it. And within an Active Directory site, Microsoft's knowledge consistency checker, which is built into Active Directory, will automatically create a two-way ring topology if there's more than two domain controllers in that site. So each of the domain controllers can just fall off the network without impacting the replication. Now, inter-site replication, as I said, is schedule-based. So if it is a tight connection, if it is a VPN without a lot of bandwidth, then you probably don't want it to replicate all the time. So what Microsoft did is they built a schedule-based pool replication scheme. And what they did is you can allow Active Directory to replicate between certain times. So if you're working for a large government organization, for instance, you might not want Active Directory to synchronize between 8:30 and 9:30 in the morning and 6:30 and 5:30 in the afternoon. You can just exclude those times for the replication and let Active Directory do its job all the other time. Just don't get in the way of people getting to work or going home. So that's really some of the brilliant stuff that Microsoft has built into replication. The knowledge consistency checker does it automatically for you, but if you're really masochistic, and I know there's a new 50 Shades of Grey movie, so I can just tell you, if you really want to go that route, you can manually modify the topology. But just remember, if you add a new site, or if you remove a site, or add a domain controller, remove a domain controller, you have to think through all the consequences that might have. But you're a brave guy, and I respect that if you do that. The way replication works, I feel, is best displayed with an animation. So I made one. So this is the animation that I've been using for the last couple of years to show you how Active Directory replication works. So inside an Active Directory site with 2 domain controllers, every Active Directory site, and this is the I have updates, come get them model. In this model, each of the domain controllers has a unique serial number, a USN. So the domain controller on the left has a USN of 400, the domain controller on the right is 270. These can differ between domain controllers, and it depends on their age. You can actually see, well, you could refer to it as the number of writes that a domain controller has performed in Active Directory during its lifetime. So yeah, if you have domain controllers that have been upgraded in place since Windows Server 2003, you would see a USN in the tens of thousands. If it's a freshly baked domain controller, it's just hundreds. So you have a unique serial number. And when 2 domain controllers are replication partners, there's going to be information on all the replication partners on each of the domain controllers. This value is stored in a high watermark table. So every domain controller knows about all the other replication partners in the high watermark table. It will know where the domain controllers are at in terms of the unique serial number. Now, when I create 100 objects on the domain controller on the left, and I replicate those over, then the unique serial number on the domain controller on the right is going to increase by 100, and high watermark table is going to reflect that for the last replication, I saw a USN for the domain controller on the left that is 500. No worries. They will work as designed. Now, if you create another object on the domain controller on the right and replicate that back, then the domain controller on the left is going to see that and increase its USN for the right and increase the high watermark table again for the domain controller. So you will see that this is an ongoing process. Now, if I revert to a snapshot for the domain controller on the right, then we're in trouble, because if Active Directory wouldn't just notice this scenario, what would happen is that the domain controller on the right would think that it would have needed to replicate back 101 objects. But in fact, it doesn't, because the high watermark table on the domain controller on the right has a different USN known for that domain controller on the left. So in this case, what will happen is that the domain controller on the right will stop replicating to the domain controller on the left. It will just ignore it. And if there's a lot of domain controllers and all of the domain controllers see the same thing, they will all ignore that one domain controller. And that one domain controller might just have certain objects with certain security identifiers that no longer live on all the other domain controllers. And that's a situation where a security identifier for an object is no longer identifiable, reliable, or reliably by Active Directory. That's a situation that one of our attendees is experiencing right now. And the way to solve that is, yeah, it is quite difficult because there's no real way to know what domain controller is right. Did I revert to that snapshot because I needed to? Did I restore a backup perfectly, or did I make a mistake? Luckily, Microsoft has some great guidance on this situation, which is called a USN, unique serial number, USN rollback situation. Microsoft has some great tools to troubleshoot that. So I hope that the guy in our audience that is facing this situation can use that information to get his Active Directory back in shape.
Okay, so we have a lot of people asking, so what about how fast does the change replicate? So I guess that doesn't depend on the read-only or the read-writeness of a domain controller, just again about the intersite or non-intersite replication, right? But Sander, do you know intersite, is it 3 hours or something, I believe is the default for replicating data, or am I wrong here? And inside the same site, it's like near instant that they replicate?
Well, there's certain changes that have priority, like password changes, and those happen, well, near immediately, and there's other replication that takes a longer time. Yeah.
Okay. And somebody's asking about, is there some kind of tool for bandwidth monitoring? But I guess that really depends on how active your Active Directory is, or how many changes you are doing, and of course how many objects you have in there. Do you know of any tool existent, or just?
Oh yeah, and I have one in my best practices that I'm sharing. Well, not right after this, but within the next 5 minutes.
Okay.
Cool.
Sounds good.
So let's dive a little deeper even and look at the multi-master model and the flexible single master operation rules. So in Active Directory, every domain controller is equal, but some domain controllers are more equal than others. So yes, you can change an object on every domain controller. You can talk to any domain controller, it doesn't really matter. And it will, if it's a read-write domain controller, it will make that change. Now, if it's a certain change, for instance, a password reset, then that domain controller is going to replicate to the PDC, the primary domain controller emulator first, and then those changes are going to originate from that server specifically to all the other domain controllers, because that is a specifically security-wise special operation. There's a lot of other things as well that Microsoft has built into the multi-master model, so Active Directory doesn't break as fast as you would, well, as you would like it to, perhaps. So there's a primary domain controller emulator, which is the source for all the password resets and group policy changes. Then there's a RID pool master, which allows you to have a centralized way to have all the relative identifiers, the last end of the security identifier pool being given out to all the other domain controllers. So you can't have identical SIDs for 2 different objects on 2 different domain controllers being created. Then there's the infrastructure master, which has lost most of its functionality in the latest versions of Windows Server. And then there's 2 forest-wide FSMA roles. And it's the schema master. So if you change something in the schema, then you have to do that on the schema master, so you don't get any corruption in your schema. And then there's the domain naming master, which is used when you create trusts or you create child domains, even in Active Directory forests, that there's one domain controller that is responsible for that. In an Active Directory environment with one domain controller, all the roles are on one domain controller. If you have multiple domain controllers, spread them a bit. There's documentation for Microsoft on that. And if you have a multi-forest environment with multi-domains per forest. You will see a couple of forest roles per forest and a lot of domain roles for each of the domains.
Okay, so we get an interesting question, which is not really the FISMA roles, but what about the global catalog? What does that do?
Yeah, so the global catalog is a server that, especially if you're talking about the infrastructure master, because there's a bit of information there, but the global catalog is used to store information on objects in other domains so that you could actually get them part of, I don't know, mail groups and stuff like that. And that way, if you'd want to do something with an account, so for instance, send him email or give him permissions on a file share, then you don't have to go through the other, through your domain controllers to domain controllers in another domain, because you've got that information cached the first time. So it just speeds inter-domain searches and relationships up.
Yeah, but maybe it's important also to stress it's a limited amount of data that is being so not all the data is replicated to the global catalog,
yes,
right?
That is correct. Yes, and you can change that if you'd want, but it's not recommended.
Okay, so we're good to go.
All right. Now let's look at the real value of Active Directory, because now the only thing that we've been talking about the last couple of, well, almost an hour actually, is inside of Active Directory and what it can do for you. But inside of an organization, the real value of Active Directory is through DNS, DHCP, and through third-party services. So DNS gives you the ability to go to a file server and address it by its name, or actually find it automatically based on your domain name. That's what DNS does. DHCP allows you to authorize only the DHCP servers that you actually want as DHCP servers in your environment. So the whole problem that you might still remember if you've ever worked with Windows XP and internet connection sharing is you can effectively ban rogue DHCP servers from your network environment using Active Directory. And then of course there's dynamic DNS so that devices can actually update their own DNS information automatically because they've got the rights to do that in the DNS zone through DHCP. Now all the VPN stuff, Citrix, NetScalers, you name it, can all be integrated with Active Directory using either LDAP, the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, or Radius, which is an even older protocol, because you can't actually domain join those VPN appliances and such, but you could connect to them doing third-party services. And that way, Active Directory offers that full scale of functionality. It offers device-independent productivity, on-premises and cloud single sign-on, the systems management, consistent user experience, and even the distributed file system for optimized access to files if you need it. Let's quickly go to the best practices, because I feel we've got a lot of questions, which is great. Thank you for that. But I'm going to go give you one of the best practices. So Microsoft is giving you recommended practices. This is the stuff that you can just apply anytime to Active Directory. So the first one is my best practices for planning domain controllers. And if you are planning for an Active Directory domain, intend to create at least 2 domain controllers per domain. If you want to have 2 domains, intend to create 4 domain controllers. And domain controllers automatically offer high availability. They automatically replicate, they automatically synchronize, all that stuff. So domain controller resiliency is easily achieved. Just build 2 domain controllers, one can just fall off the network without much problem. It's easy as pie. Then, of course, if you want to have your domain controllers be reliable and be first-class citizens of your networking environment, intend to implement server role separation. Because especially Internet Information Services, IIS, and SQL servers introduce security implications when you install them on domain controllers. So please don't do that, unless it's a small business server or Windows Server Essential server, because those are optimized for those workloads. And if you are going to implement domain controllers, use hardware that is still on the guarantee or extend the guarantee, and use a Windows Server operating system that still gets support from Microsoft for the period in which you intend to use the domain controller as a domain controller. So nowadays, if you install a physical domain controller, the best way to benefit from that is to plan it for the next 4 years. In 4 years' time, Windows Server 2008, Windows Server 2008-02, and Windows Server 2012 is, but Windows Server 2008 and Windows Server 2008-02 are not going to be supported anymore by Microsoft. So please don't use those operating systems for new domain controllers. So where do you place domain controllers? And how do you place them? Well, properly dimension the server's hardware and software. As I said, if you're going to use, or if you're going to service more than 300,000 end users, apply more than 4 gigs of RAM. There's a infrastructure planning and design guide. There's an AD sizer tool that you can use to create the best domain controllers for your situation. Now, when you intend to implement virtualized domain controllers, please have the correct procedures in place. If you don't, if for instance, you use Windows Server 2008 or Windows Server 2008-02 domain controllers, or even before, then make sure your virtualization admin knows that it's not going to mess with your domain controllers. Please let them run, don't do snapshots, stuff like that. And if you're going to use Windows Server templates, always run sysprep.exe, because else you're going to have SID namespace problems. And before you install Windows Server, especially on physical boxes, run the memory diagnostics from the Windows Server DVD. It's the same thing you do when you install a new virtualization host. You also run the memory diagnostics, because if everything cached in RAM, if everything is RAM intensive, as it is these days, if your RAM is broken, your functionality is going to be broken. And after you've promoted your domain controllers, document the passwords. The directory service restore mode password is your fail-safe password if the Active Directory domain service is unable to run on any of your domain controllers. This is the only password that will get you in those boxes and actually fix stuff. And don't forget to install anti-malware, uninterruptible power supply software, monitoring agents, and stuff like that. And follow the vendor's best practices on inclusions for anti-malware, for instance, and configuration. And don't forget, Microsoft recommends System Center Operations Manager for Windows Server. And of course, to promote domain controllers and make that a reliable and repeatable process, use answer files and get them checked, get them signed off, and then use them. And you can actually just get them into your documentation. You can just paste them into your documentation when you're done with them, because by the time Active Directory is done with them, it will scrub all the passwords out. So you won't have to worry about passwords in your documentation. Of course, check the logs after you've promoted your domain controller, because it will give you really useful information on how domain controller promotion went and if anything went wrong. And well, almost immediately after you've promoted the domain controller, run Windows Update, because Active Directory updates, either through Windows Update or WSUS, doesn't really matter, only apply to Windows Server domain controllers after you've added the Active Directory domain services role. Before that, it will not know that the server is going to be a domain controller, so it won't issue the updates to it. And of course, run the Active Directory Best Practices Analyzer, because it protects you against 90% of all the data loss scenarios. And that is really easy. It is a 5-minute trick that will give you some free advice on how to optimize your Active Directory. So if I go to my demo environment, which I have here, I'm going to place it in full screen. I've got my server manager right here. I'm starting it up. I go to my local server, and it will take some time to give me all the roles that it has, because it has the ADDS server, DNS, DHCP, and you name it on it. If I go to ADDS in the left navigation pane, and then I scroll down a bit on the right, then there's the best practices analyzer right here. And I ran it this morning, and it already giving me 4 pieces of advice that I need to protect all the organizational units in this domain from accidental deletion, because they're not. It is a virtual domain controller, so please comply with the recommended best practices. And if you click on that, it will take you to a Microsoft page with all those best practices. It should properly synchronize time from a valid time source. This is the thing that you will see on any domain controller which has the PDC emulator role. And all domains should have at least 2 domain controllers for redundancy. And I know I only have 1 in this demo environment. But I'm going to fix that in the second webinar.
Okay, so are you still up for some questions?
So that was fun.
So somebody's asking about Office 365, about synchronization.
Timothy.
Yeah. But hi, are you there? Sander, are you still there?
Yes. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions. So somebody's asking about Office 365. To cover that, I think that's going to be a bit tough. But I guess if you want to synchronize your credentials with Office 365, you need a DirSync tool, right? So maybe look into that, right? And then somebody else is asking about what about Macs? So would you bind Macs to Active Directory? Do you have any experience with that? So Apple computers.
Yeah. So there's DirSync, which is DirSync is the old tool, but Azure AD Connect is the new tool.
Okay.
Yep. Synchronizing, or actually authenticating MacBooks to Active Directory, there's a great third-party solution for that, which is called Centrify.
Okay.
I really recommend that.
Okay. So, another question, what is the relationship between Exchange and Active Directory? I guess Exchange uses Active Directories to store extra attributes, information about the users, right?
Absolutely. Yep. Exchange has its own schema extensions, and then you can fill Active Directory with all the stuff that you need in Exchange server.
Okay, so somebody's asking, so on a remote site, would you deploy 1 remote domain controller, or would you deploy 2? I guess 2 is better, but of course it's going to use just more resources at the other site. As long as you define 2 sites, there is only going to be 1 bridge ahead, so the replication is only being done to 1 Active Directory server, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, and then somebody's asking, is there a lifespan on Active Directory domain controllers? Like, should I demote the domain controller after a while because it's getting older or something like that?
That's a great question, and yeah, you should demote a domain controller if it is reaching a certain moment in time in terms of the unique serial number, because the unique serial number has a maximum value of about 2 billion.
Okay, so after a while you really need it, right?
Yeah, I have not encountered any such Active Directory environment, but you could. Yep.
Okay, somebody is asking.
We're talking really big Active Directory environments.
Okay, so somebody is asking about migration from 2003 to 2016. I guess the only way there is, I looked it up, is from 2003 to 2012, and then from 2012 you can probably go to 2016.
That is correct. Yeah, that's a 2-step migration.
Okay, so let's see, it's going fast here. Okay, so can I verify if the administrative center is installed? Yeah, so if it's not installed, install the AirSat tools, and otherwise just look in the start menu, right? Because it's just there, we showed that. How can you find the USN numbers? Well, you can use LDP, or you can put the Active Directory in advanced mode, but I don't think you have to be too worried about the USN numbers, right?
No, and it's you can actually look that up through Performance Monitor since Windows Server 2012.
Okay.
It will tell you the DNT, which is closely related to the USN. Yes.
Okay, so we see here another question. Are there issues with demoting a 2003 R2 and promoting a 2012 R2? I guess that has to, as long as you don't do the functionality level higher, if you don't upgrade that one, you'll find you can have intermixed, right?
Absolutely.
For a little while you're doing the migration.
Yeah, I don't recommend on using more than 2 Windows Server versions for domain controllers because it adds complexity in procedures and processes and stuff like that. But you could, yeah.
Okay, so replacing an old TC, what is the best way? I guess we covered that as well a bit, is doing a demote, well, first promoting the first one and then demoting the old one, right? And then somebody's asking about the best practices tool. They might not have paid attention, but we actually showed that one. So
you're breaking apart in audio.
Okay. What's the process of upgrading from 2008 to 2016? Again, I guess that's a two-step process going to 2012 and then to 2016. And then a lot of people are asking about, can I rewatch this? Absolutely, we are recording this and we will publish it later on our website. It does take some time, so probably in the next day it will be on our website so you can rewatch it later. Okay, we need to wrap up.
Absolutely.
Because we are really going over time here. Thank you all for being so attentive and for asking so many questions. I'm sorry we couldn't cover all of your questions, but it's just too much and we have to really wrap it up here. Do come back for our next webinars. We will have some more time to answer more questions and to go deeper into the virtualization part, because I've saw a lot of questions about Active Directory and virtualization, but also about the recovery part. How can you do item level recovery, but also what about full VM recovery with Veeam, for example. So we'll talk about that later. Okay, thank you all, but also big thank you to you, Sander, for presenting. I think
my pleasure.
Found it really useful, and hopefully see you soon. And like I said, go to our website, go to the resources, export webinars. If you didn't find the link yet, you will find it there. Okay, see you later all, and thank you all.